At 10 o'clock on the night of March 22, 1945, the American artillery stayed quiet. That was the strange part. No rolling barrage, no bomber stream, no thunder from the western bank. No warning at all. Just black water moving north through Germany, and a line of soldiers carrying assault boats through muddy vineyards with their hands clamped over anything that might rattle. The Rhine was in front of them, not a creek, not a canal, not another French river with a name they had learned and then left behind. The Rhine. For centuries, armies had treated it like a locked door into Germany. The Germans had blown the bridges, fortified the far bank, and waited for the Allies to do what armies usually do before a crossing that big. They expected noise. They expected preparation. They expected the sky to announce the attack before the first boat touched the water. Instead, the first wave went in like a secret. Men from Patton's Third Army pushed their boats off the bank at Oppenheim, dipped their paddles carefully, and let the current take the bow. The river pulled at them immediately. They corrected in silence. On the eastern side, the German sentries did not understand what they were hearing, if they heard anything at all. That is how one of the most important crossings of the Second World War began. Not with a speech, not with a massive bombardment, not with the grand operation the Allied newspapers were waiting to celebrate. It began with 6 battalions moving through the dark before Bernard Montgomery's million-man crossing to the north had even started. And somewhere behind the lines, George S. Patton was about to create 2 problems at once: a military problem for the Germans and a political problem for Dwight Eisenhower. Because if Patton succeeded, he would be across Hitler's most symbolic river before the most carefully prepared crossing in Allied history. If he failed, he would have stranded American infantry on the wrong side of the Rhine with daylight coming. And if the wrong people found out too early, the entire bridgehead could vanish before morning. The strangest part is that the men at the top may have known exactly what was coming. They simply had very good reasons not to write it down. To understand why the night mattered so much, you have to understand what the Rhine meant before a single American boat touched it. It was not just a military obstacle. It was a myth with water in it. The river runs from the Alps to the North Sea, crossing Europe like a scar that had become a border. Rome had looked at it and treated it as the edge of the ordered world. Caesar crossed it to prove that he could. Later emperors guarded it. Generations of German soldiers sang about it. In German memory, the Rhine was not merely a line on a map. It was a boundary between invasion and homeland. By March of 1945, it was also the last great natural defense between the Western Allies and the heart of Germany. The Wehrmacht had destroyed bridge after bridge as it retreated. Railroad spans twisted into the water. Road bridges had dropped into the current. Any crossing the Allies made would have to be forced, supplied, and protected under German guns. That was the normal problem. The abnormal problem was the rivalry among the men who wanted to cross it first. 300 miles north of Oppenheim, Field Marshal Bernard Law Montgomery was preparing Operation Plunder. Montgomery did not believe in gambling when preparation could do the work instead. He wanted artillery, air cover, smoke, naval landing craft, rehearsed infantry, airborne troops, and overwhelming mass. He had earned his reputation in North Africa. He had commanded ground forces in Normandy. He was meticulous, stubborn, brilliant in his way, and almost perfectly designed to irritate American commanders who measured genius in speed. For weeks, Montgomery built the kind of operation that could not be hidden. More than 1 million Allied troops were gathered in the northern sector. Thousands of artillery pieces were positioned. Landing craft had been hauled across land. Smoke had covered the buildup for days. Airborne divisions waited for a daylight drop east of the river. Operation Plunder was not sneaking up on anybody. It was a hammer being lifted in full view of the room, and Montgomery meant for the world to see it fall. 300 miles south, Patton looked at the same river and saw a different kind of door. He had never trusted waiting when motion might solve the problem first. He had built his reputation on hard turns, fast advances, and the kind of timing that made headquarters nervous. In Sicily, he had already beaten Montgomery to Messina after being assigned the supporting role. In France, he had raced across open country after the breakout from Normandy. During the Bulge, he had wheeled the Third Army north with a speed that looked impossible until it happened. Patton was theatrical, vain, deeply religious, profane, learned, reckless, and sometimes appallingly careless with his own mouth. But he understood momentum, and by late March 1945, momentum was one of the few things Germany could no longer afford to lose. The official plan did not center Patton. Montgomery's northern crossing was the main event. Patton's Third Army was not supposed to steal the front page. Patton had spent too many years watching front pages to misunderstand what that meant. On March 19th, Omar Bradley met with him in Luxembourg. Bradley commanded the American 12th Army Group and knew exactly how much the Americans hated the idea of waiting for Montgomery's grand performance. According to the official history, Bradley gave Patton the opening he needed. Take the Rhine on the run. On the run. Not after 6 weeks of public preparation, not after every gun was in place, not after the British newspapers had their headline. If the enemy was breaking, then do not pause and let him become solid again. That phrase is one of the keys to the whole story, because it gave Patton permission without necessarily creating a paper trail detailed enough to embarrass Eisenhower. And Eisenhower had every reason to prefer ambiguity. Coalition command is not the same as battlefield command. Eisenhower was not only fighting Germany, he was managing American ambition, British pride, political pressure from Washington, political pressure from London, and a collection of senior commanders who could behave like feuding princes whenever credit was involved. If Patton crossed first and Eisenhower openly encouraged it, Montgomery would see it as an insult. If Patton crossed first and failed, Eisenhower would own the disaster. If Patton crossed first and succeeded, Eisenhower would have to celebrate it without destroying the dignity of the British operation still waiting to begin. So the record becomes slippery right where it matters most. Bradley later implied that the move was less surprising than the official version made it sound. Patton's diary grows strangely unhelpful in the days before the crossing. Eisenhower's public posture remained careful. In war, sometimes a commander does not want to know a thing too clearly until after it works. On the morning of March 22nd, Major General Manton Eddy received the order that turned possibility into danger. Patton wanted 12th Corps across that night. Not soon, not when everything was perfect. That night. Eddy passed it to Major General Stafford Leroy Irwin of the 5th Infantry Division. Irwin knew what the order meant. His men had crossed rivers before. They were good at it. The Red Diamond Division had forced crossings at the Moselle, the Saar, the Sauer. They knew boats, currents, wet gear, terrified silence, and the awful moment when a dark bank suddenly lights up with muzzle flashes. But the Rhine was different. A crossing on that scale normally required time, coordination, rehearsals, bridging equipment, artillery plans, smoke, engineers, traffic control, and luck. Irwin reportedly objected because much of what he wanted was not in place the way a careful commander would want it. Then he said the sentence Patton needed to hear. He could get some men across. That was enough. All afternoon, the Third Army began hiding motion inside ordinary motion. Pontoon equipment moved under tarpaulins. Assault boats were shifted forward. Engineers checked loads. Roads near Oppenheim and Neerstein filled with trucks that looked, from a distance, like any other tired logistics column crawling east in the last spring of the war. That invisibility mattered. Aerial reconnaissance had become one of the curses of modern war. A great operation revealed itself by its weight. Too many vehicles, too much smoke, too many guns, too many men moving at the wrong time toward the same place. Patton's crossing did not look great from the sky. That was the point. It looked like routine. Underneath the routine was a countdown. By evening, the assault troops were receiving instructions in voices barely above a breath. No smoking, no shouting, no loose equipment, no metal knocking against metal. Helmets deadened, gear taped. Every small sound treated as if it might carry across the water and wake the far bank. There is a special kind of fear in a silent attack. In a bombardment, terror has a soundtrack. Men can be afraid inside the noise. They can tell themselves the guns are doing something for them. Here, there was nothing to hide inside. Just the dark, the river, the knowledge that if one German machine gun opened at the right moment, men would start dying in boats with nowhere to go. At 2200 hours, the word moved down the line. Move. A worst boats slid into the Rhine. The soldiers did not row like men in a race. They paddled like thieves. The current grabbed them and tried to carry them offline. The men corrected with small strokes. On the western bank, more boats waited in the dark. On the eastern bank, the defenders were mostly not the kind of men the Germans would have chosen if Germany still had choices. Volkssturm. Old men, factory workers, boys in some sectors. Men in uniforms that often fit the emergency better than they fit the body. Many had old rifles, thin training, and very little ability to call down the kind of fire that might have stopped a crossing in its first minutes. They had been told the Americans were not about to cross there. They believed it until the Americans were already on the bank. The first waves landed with almost unreal luck. Resistance was scattered and confused. No great German artillery storm crashed down. No organized counterattack hit the first boats. The silence that had protected the Americans on the approach continued to confuse the defenders after the landing. By 2 in the morning on March 23rd, the 11th Infantry Regiment was across. The 10th Infantry followed. By dawn, 6 battalions of American infantry were on the eastern side of the Rhine, digging into German soil and waiting for the counterblow that everybody expected and nobody could dismiss. The casualty count for the assault was astonishingly low, 34 killed and wounded. 34 for 6 battalions forced across one of Europe's great defended rivers at night without preparation fire. That number is so small that it almost damages belief. It should not be read as proof that the task was easy. It is proof of how completely surprise had worked. But the crossing was only the first half of the gamble. Infantry can seize a bridgehead. Infantry cannot feed it, armor it, or turn it into a road. For that, Patton needed engineers. And while the riflemen were still establishing the far bank, the 249th Engineer Combat Battalion began the work that would decide whether the night became a legend or a trap. Their job was brutally simple to describe. Build a floating bridge across the Rhine. In darkness, under threat of artillery, under threat of German aircraft, with a live bridgehead still thin on the eastern side, across roughly 1,200 feet of cold, moving water. Pontoon bridging is not glamorous in the way a tank attack is glamorous. It does not produce the same kind of paintings. Men work in mud, water, darkness, and noise. They guide sections. They fight current. They connect parts that never feel light enough, never arrive fast enough, and never forgive clumsy handling. The bridge is a machine made out of timing. One missed movement can injure a man. One shell can turn hours of work into wreckage. One aircraft getting through at dawn can make the entire bridgehead pay for the engineer's failure. But the 249th kept building. German shells found the general area. They struck vineyards, roads, and open ground. Aircraft appeared and were met by American anti-aircraft fire. The men worked through it. 18 hours later, the bridge was complete. A road now lay on top of the river. That is the part of the story that should not be hidden behind Patton's personality. Patton could order the crossing. Bradley could approve the tempo. Eisenhower could manage the politics. But the thing that turned a night raid into an operational breakthrough was built by engineers whose names almost never appear in the headline version. They made the river usable, and once the Rhine became usable, German time began to disappear. In the early hours after the crossing, Patton called Bradley. This call has become one of the famous little scenes of the Western Front because it shows a side of Patton people rarely imagine. He did not roar. He did not summon the press. He did not demand immediate glory. He lowered his voice. "Brad, don't tell anyone, but I'm across." Bradley asked, "Across what?" "Across the Rhine." Patton told him he had slipped a division over during the night and wanted silence until they knew whether the bridgehead would hold. For once, the loudest American general in Europe needed secrecy more than attention. That restraint was not modesty, it was survival. If the German High Command realized too early that Third Army was already across, what remained of German reserves might be thrown toward Oppenheim before American armor and artillery could reinforce the lodgment. Surprise had opened the door, but the door could still be slammed shut, so Patton waited. Not for long. By later on March 23rd, the bridgehead was stronger. German reconnaissance had begun to see what had happened. Secrecy was leaking away. And in the north, Montgomery's long-prepared operation was about to begin. Patton called Bradley again. The whisper was gone. "Tell the world we're across." He wanted the announcement out before Montgomery started. There it was. Military sense and personal rivalry in the same breath. Because Operation Plunder, when it opened that evening, was everything Patton's crossing had not been. At Wesel and along the northern Rhine, thousands of Allied guns erupted. The bombardment was immense. The earth shook. British, Canadian, and American troops crossed in a massive, coordinated operation. Airborne forces dropped east of the river in Operation Varsity the next day. The whole machine worked with the weight and preparation Montgomery valued. It was a success. It was also costly. The northern operation made history in scale. Patton's crossing made history in timing. And history, unfairly but predictably, remembers timing. Montgomery had prepared the hammer. Patton had found the latch. Eisenhower now had to keep both men from turning victory into a public feud. When the news reached Supreme Headquarters, Eisenhower understood the shape of the problem immediately. As a soldier, he could admire the move. As Supreme Commander, he could not indulge in American triumphalism at British expense. Churchill cared about British prestige. Montgomery cared about Montgomery's prestige. The alliance had survived North Africa, Sicily, Normandy, the Bulge, and endless arguments over command authority, resources, and credit. A careless headline could do damage no German division was still capable of doing. So Eisenhower did what Eisenhower did best. He absorbed the pressure. Publicly, he balanced the praise. He recognized Montgomery's enormous planned crossing and Patton's audacious success without inviting a war inside the alliance. Privately, he sent Patton a letter of warm appreciation, praising the Third Army's performance from the moment it had entered battle the previous year. He did not need to mention Montgomery for Patton to understand the meaning of the silence. Eisenhower's job was not to tell the most satisfying version of the truth. His job was to win the war without letting the coalition crack before the finish line. On the German side, the situation was much simpler and much worse. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring had recently taken command in the West. He was a professional soldier, not a magician. When reports came in that Americans were across at Oppenheim, the obvious question was what reserves could hit them before the crossing expanded. The answer was nearly nothing. Germany still issued orders in the language of strength, but by March 1945, that strength often existed only on paper. The Luftwaffe was a shadow. Fuel was scarce. Units were broken, scattered, or moving without the equipment that made their names sound dangerous. There were tanks in the region, guns in the region, men in the region. There was not enough of anything in the right place at the right time. Kesselring sent what he could. American artillery and aircraft helped break up the response. Anti-aircraft batteries guarded the bridge. The German attack never became the decisive blow the bridgehead needed to fear. The bridge stood. And once the bridge stood, the Central Front began to come apart. By March 26th, thousands of American troops had passed through the Oppenheim-Nierstein crossing. Armor rolled east. The bridgehead deepened. German formations that had fought bitterly for months now found themselves facing a speed they could not absorb. Frankfurt fell before the end of March. Patton's army kept moving into Germany. The distance that had taken the Allies 8 months to fight from Normandy to the Rhine was followed by a rush across the Reich that took only weeks. This does not mean the war became harmless. Men still died, towns still burned, units still fought, camps were uncovered. The final weeks brought their own horror and exhaustion, but the strategic barrier had broken. The locked door was open, and the road across it had been built in the dark by men whose work was finished before most of the world knew it had begun. Patton, of course, could not resist making the crossing personal. On March 24th, he came to the bridge at Oppenheim with aides and a photographer. The moment that followed has been told so many times that it lives halfway between history and theater, which is exactly where Patton liked to stand. He walked onto the pontoon bridge, stopped above the river, and relieved himself into the Rhine. Then, on the far bank, he scooped up German soil in both hands, echoing the old story of William the Conqueror claiming England by rising with earth in his fists. It was crude. It was calculated. It was ridiculous. It was pure Patton. He later sent Eisenhower a message that matched the man perfectly. He had done the symbolic thing, crossed the mythic river, and now, for God's sake, he needed gasoline. That is the contradiction of Patton in one image. The general posing for legend while asking for fuel. The showman who still understood that armies move on supply. The rival who wanted headlines, but only after the bridgehead could survive them. Montgomery never forgot the insult of being made second in the public mind. In his own accounts, he devoted enormous attention to the northern crossing and barely acknowledged Oppenheim. That omission was not accidental. Montgomery knew what had happened. He also knew what it had cost him in the invisible contest of prestige. Patton had crossed first. Not bigger, not cleaner, not more formally. First. And in the final weeks of a war, first can become the word that sticks. Yet the oldest men in this story were not the generals. They were the German militia on the far bank who had been asked to hold a sacred river with exhausted bodies and obsolete hopes. And the quietest men in the story were not in the conference rooms. They were the engineers in the dark water. Decades later, at Nierstein, a memorial would honor the 249th Engineer Combat Battalion for the bridge they built across the Rhine. That choice matters. It refuses to let the entire event collapse into a contest between Patton and Montgomery. Because a river crossing is not accomplished by personality. It is accomplished by infantry who paddle into black water, by engineers who connect steel and timber while shells fall nearby, by drivers who bring the right equipment forward without blocking the road, by signalmen, medics, anti-aircraft crews, and exhausted officers doing arithmetic in the dark. The generals decide whether to bring the hammer or try the latch. The men below them build the passage either way. Patton did not live long after the war. In December 1945, months after Germany surrendered, he was badly injured in a low-speed vehicle accident near Mannheim. The crash barely hurt the other passengers. Patton's neck struck the partition in his staff car. He survived for 12 days, paralyzed, with his wife at his side, and died on December 21st. He was buried in Luxembourg, among the soldiers of the Third Army. Montgomery lived for decades, wrote his memoirs, defended his method, and never gave Patton the full satisfaction of generous praise. Eisenhower lived with the memory of both men and the burden of having commanded them. The Rhine kept moving. That is what rivers do after men make myths out of them. They carry away the noise first, then the bridges, then the shouting, then the arguments over who deserves the line in the book. But on the night of March 22nd, 1945, before the speeches and memoirs and rival claims, there was only a dark current, a silent boat, and men trying not to let their paddles splash. Montgomery brought the hammer, Patton found the latch, and the engineers built the door.